the spring of 2000, the lifeless body of a teenage girl is found in the Lorette River, near a suburb of Quebec City. The investigation will uncover the story of a crime of passion involving two young lovers. L'Ancienne-Lorette is a small and peaceful community located about 10 kilometers from Quebec City. On April 7, 2000, two students walk in a wooded area near their school. Along the river, they spot what they think is a mannequin laying at the edge of the water. Moving closer, they realize it's a dead body. Terrified, they immediately alert a teacher who contacts the police.
We received a call to the effect that L'Ancienne-Lorette high school students had found a body in the Lorette River. Following that, a team of investigators, including Detective Sergeant Charlène Paquette and Ghislaine Martel, went to the scene to begin our investigation.
At the time, Remy Doyon was a forensic identification specialist for the Sainte Foy police.
Even before I left, I contacted the officers to make sure they secured a large crime scene and to prevent anyone from entering the area by using police tape around the perimeter. It's important. If the public or even the police enter the scene, a lot of evidence can be destroyed. That gave me a huge crime scene of about 4,000 square feet to examine. Before we touch anything, even the victim, I take a lot of photographs so that if I disturb something or if someone else touches something, we have a photographic record as a reference. My routine is to work outward from the victim, and I use very particular methods to ensure no part of the crime scene is overlooked. I saw the body lying in the water, about 30 to 40 meters away from me. She was caught on the rocks. The current may have carried her to that point, or the crime may have occurred there. I saw a person for sure, with fairly long hair, but I couldn't determine for certain if the body was male or female. It was fully clothed and dressed appropriately for the weather. It was April, and she had on a jacket and pants that appeared to be correct for the season. It wasn't until I was on the same side of the river as the victim and turned the body over that I realized it was a girl. Physically, her hands appeared normal, and her face was not emaciated. Her skin tone was okay, for a victim, I mean. Her color was okay, and she was not very decomposed. There wasn't anything telling us her body was not in an advanced state of decomposition. The water was quite cold, about 5 degrees Celsius, which helped to preserve the condition of the body. Whether it was there for 24 hours or 48 hours, 72, we couldn't determine at that time.
Are the police dealing with a crime or an accident?
There was no evidence that the victim had been sexually assaulted. She was fully clothed, including her underwear, and her pants had not been removed, so as far as we were concerned, it was not a crime of a sexual nature.
Although at the time we could certainly see that there were some wounds to the neck and throat area, the injuries were not large. They were small, but something had definitely stabbed her there a few times. It couldn't be determined whether that's what really killed her or if she had actually drowned, but one thing was certain. From that moment, we were sure this was not a natural death, so all necessary precautions were taken. We always begin with the worst-case scenario, so we start by assuming it's a crime. We work according to this rule so that we don't overlook crucial evidence by moving too quickly.
Police gather all the evidence they can find at the scene and mark each item with an exhibit number.
To do a thorough search on such a large crime scene takes quite some time. After all of the evidence was marked, we turned the body over and brought it out of the river.
It's very important for us to get the body out of the water as intact as possible and then search it in order to identify the victim.
That's how investigators begin their investigation. If you have a victim without identification, there is nothing for the investigator to start with.
In searching the victim's clothes, Remy Doyon discovers some small balls of paper in the pocket of her jeans.
It was a piece of white paper with a telephone number written on it. It was written in ink and still very legible. The water had not caused any deterioration. There were spots of mud on the paper, but it was still quite legible. And then there was another ball of paper, which could be unraveled immediately. It was a portion of a bus transfer. I'd photographed this evidence at the scene, and we transcribed the details for the investigator immediately. I dried the papers overnight and then sent them to the exhibit room for use as evidence.
The body of the young woman is removed from the crime scene and is pronounced dead by the coroner before being transported to the morgue in Quebec City.
We needed to establish where the stabbing occurred. So when we considered the current, the width of the river, and all the log debris, the body could not have moved a great distance.
It seemed to me the next most important thing was to walk upstream, because although she could have come from the shore, the crime could have taken place a little higher upstream on the bank, and her body could have been brought down by the current. So it was mainly the riverbank that interested me as the crime scene. We look for things that may be directly involved, a weapon, items like that, but it is rare that those objects are what will lead us to the murderer. The evidence may be of no apparent significance on the day itself, but a few months later, an item can turn out to be of huge importance. It is often like this at a crime scene. We collect evidence without knowing whether it will be important, but instinctually pick it up anyway.
The search for clues continues for hours. At one point, Remy Doyon makes a curious discovery. Engraved on the trunk of a tree is the inscription Melio, followed by a heart pierced by an arrow and the initials TP.
It told me nothing. I didn't see this being any more relevant than any other evidence here. But actually, the carving on the tree was quite recent. So I took a photograph, and it subsequently made it into the file as evidence. But at the time, it was inconclusive and did not seem to serve any real purpose. We advised the chief investigator of the carving, but nothing came of it at the time.
Remy Doyon completes his examination of the crime scene and then goes to the morgue. The next day, the body of the young victim will be transported to Montreal, where all Quebec autopsies take place. He wants to make sure they haven't missed anything during the search of the clothing, and that the victim's hands are well protected in case they hide traces of the murderer's DNA. He also has to take fingerprints.
At the scene, it's impossible to take fingerprints because the fingers, you know, when you take a bath and stay too long in the water, how your fingers will feel? Then try to imagine how wrinkled your fingers could be if immersed for several days.
Given the wrinkled condition of the victim's fingers, Remy Doyon must reinflate the skin.
We use a syringe to inject water under the skin, which fills out the wrinkles. Once that's done and you take a look, the finger will appear almost normal. We can then spread a little ink on the finger and then roll the prints. At that moment, the imprint can be quite good. The print I took of the middle finger was very good.
Despite her obvious young age, no one reported the victim missing in the days before her body was discovered. Who is she? How did she come to such a tragic end? The body of a young woman with stab wounds in the neck is found face down in the Lorette River near Quebec City. Her identity remains unknown, and there have been no reports of a missing person in the region. Armed with only a woman's name and a phone number scribbled on a piece of paper found in the victim's pants, Detective Sergeant Le Godard begins his search for the killer.
Once we finished with the crime scene and began our investigation, we tried to establish the relationship of the name and phone number to our victim because there was no other identification. We found the address corresponding to the phone number, which was a young woman in Saint Roch, Quebec.
Saint Roch is one of the oldest neighborhoods in Quebec City. At the time, it was home to many homeless, addicts, and prostitutes.
My colleague, Detective Sergeant Charlene Paquette, and I went to speak to the young woman in Saint Roch. We showed the girl photographs of the victim's clothes. She confirmed that the items belonged to her and that she had loaned them to a young girl named Tanya Pinette.
The young woman explained she had recently met Tanya and agreed to let her stay with her. Tanya left her backpack at the apartment, but never returned for it.
She loaned the clothes to Tanya on March 30th, 2000, and said Tanya told her that she was going to L'Ancienne Lorette to see her boyfriend. She sensed that Tanya was nervous about going back to him.
Based on the information given by the young woman, investigators learned Youth Protection had placed Tanya at the Stopover Center, a shelter for young women in need. She was only 15 years old. Le Godard immediately contacts the center.
An official from the youth center came to the morgue to identify the body. Tanya Pinette was positively identified as one of their charges. Following confirmation of the victim's identification, we now had names of individuals who knew the victim while she was a runaway during the month of November 1999. We met with all these young people who were friends of the victim while she was a runaway. They knew what she did and who she met up with until her death.
One of the people the investigators question is Tanya's older sister, also a Stopover Center resident. She tells them that Tanya was dating a young man named Jesse Baroui. He and Tanya reportedly lived together. Apparently, Tanya wanted to return to Sept-Îles, her hometown, to live with her grandparents. Jesse allegedly threatened to kill her if she left him.
We sent 2 detective sergeants to ask Jesse Baroui to meet with us at our offices. Jesse stated he wasn't interested in doing that. But after calling his lawyer, he agreed to come to our offices for questioning.
Jesse said he hadn't seen Tanya for over a week. Her father had come to stay with them for a few days, but after an argument, Jesse had thrown them both out. All the information police have so far points to Jesse as their prime suspect, but what the investigators need now is proof that he is the killer. The results of the autopsy conducted by the late Dr. Louis Raymond Trudeau have become available. Jacinthe Prévost is a forensic biologist at the Laboratory of Forensic Science and Forensic Medicine in Montreal. She worked on the Tanya Pinette case.
Swabs were taken of the mouth, vaginal, and rectal areas, and then sent to pathology. The results of these tests indicated there was no evidence of semen at all. Often when a woman is killed like this, we investigate whether there is any evidence of a sexual assault, and we look for anything that could be related to that. There weren't any bloodstains other than those of the victim. There was no male profile associated with the victim's body.
Donc, il n'y avait pas de profil mâle associé à son corps.
If there are bloodstains present from a potential assailant, one might find those on the victim's back. Even in the case of a water environment, the genetic profile can still be found in the washed out blood. If there was a sexual assault, water has no impact in the vagina or oral cavities. We found no drug or substance toxicology, and the blood alcohol was negative. We found 8 small wounds, about ½ centimeter wide, on the right side of the victim's neck. At least 2 of the wounds had punctured the carotid artery, which could have been fatal. However, the official cause of death was attributed to drowning. So while these stab wounds to the neck were created by a thin, single-edged blade, the victim actually drowned. That was the cause of death.
After being stabbed, was the victim drowned by her assailant, or did she drown while looking for help? Denis Legodard's colleague, Charlene Paquette, attends the autopsy.
When we met with Detective Sergeant Paquette, she explained that when she first met the suspect on the 9th, he had in his possession a knife. This knife was very similar to the one that caused the injuries on the victim's neck.
Finding the knife is a priority for Legodard. Because the investigation is in its early stages, he must first consider all evidence and any information provided, as improbable as it may seem to him. To prepare a strong case, he must determine the accuracy of each clue and establish its importance. Legodard's objective is to address any argument that a defense lawyer could present in a future trial.
The victim had a history of self-harm, which was problematic in creating a case. We had to remove the possibility that the victim stabbed herself. To eliminate that possibility, I would have to find a knife at the scene.
The investigator came to see me to ask if we could search the riverbed. I said yes, we can always search with a metal detector. However, the river is about a foot deep and we can't see the bottom as such because the spring runoff water is not clear at all. But he said I want more than that. So I said, okay, I'll look into what we can do.
Sergeant Doyon had heard about a new technology that was effective in damming a river almost instantly.
The police called me simply because they wanted to look for clues at the crime scene. And then, well, they knew that placing the water barrier in the river would replace hundreds of sandbags and save time.
The water barrier is made of polymer canvas, a very resistant material. It's made so that when it unfolds, its two panels make up a 90-degree angle. One of the panels is held down with rocks or other heavy objects. As soon as water starts to flow into it, the other panel acts as a parachute. The pressure created by the water current holds it in place.
I brought a water barrier 28 inches deep by 35 feet long. And then I also brought a large pump in order to pump all of the water from the river, because we simply can't stop the water indefinitely. The water will eventually go right over the barrier.
They pumped the water out on top of the riverbank because the river we were in goes around a sort of bend there. So we had nearly 200 feet in which to search for evidence in the riverbed.
Once it was installed, the barrier remained in position for a period of perhaps 5 or 6 hours, long enough for the investigators to thoroughly search for clues.
Even though there was minimal water in the riverbed, we used the metal detectors anyway. It was much better that way, and we could really search the river the way we should.
Will the investigators find the murder weapon? Or will they determine that Tanya committed suicide? The lifeless body of Tanya Pinette is found in the Lorette River near Quebec City. She was 15 when she had run away from a young woman's shelter. Investigators are looking for her murder weapon in the river. They install a water barrier to assist their search.
So, by diverting the water from the riverbed and the banks, no weapon was found. That proved to us that the victim had not committed suicide.
Had it been a suicide, the weapon would still be at the scene. But since Legodard didn't find anything, he assumes the assailant took the weapon with him.
Therefore, what interested us now was recovering the knife that had been seen in the possession of the suspect.
Le Godard orders a search of the apartment where Tanya and her boyfriend Jesse had lived together.
One must understand that 10 days after the victim's body was discovered, the suspect gave up his apartment in La Lorette and went back to live with his mother.
Since the suspect no longer lived in the apartment, a warrant was not required for investigators to conduct a search of the premises. From what I know of the law, because he was no longer a tenant there and he had left, the process moved far more rapidly than it would have otherwise. It can sometimes be easier to analyze a crime scene, an apartment, or a vehicle because it is no longer owned or inhabited by the suspect.
Our goal was to determine whether the crime was committed in the apartment.
My specialty is forensic biology, but particularly the study of blood stains and blood spatters. Therefore, I work primarily on serious crime scenes. That is to say, homicides or attempted murders. I also look for blood stains and blood spatter on clothing or on objects used in crimes, the murder weapons or different things like that. I take samples and I make determinations of biological substances. The blood, of course, but also saliva, semen, and hair. Then we do serologic testing. That is to say, we determine the nature of the biological substance, and then when necessary, we do a genetic study. We determine the genetic profile of biological substances and compare that to the victim. That way, one can find the victim's blood, for instance, on the suspect's clothing or a weapon, and one can also find, for example, the genetic profile in semen found in the victim's vagina, which could be compared with the genetic profile of a suspect we have obtained an arrest warrant for. I started working on the Tanya Pinette case nearly 3 weeks after her discovery, so after the autopsy. Investigators had made a lot of progress in the investigation. I was asked to search for bloodstains in the residence Tanya Pinette shared with her boyfriend. So it's a little apartment, 2-bedroom, I think, small, empty. All I had to do was search for blood on the floors, walls, in the bathroom, and then on the mattress that was left there. So certainly when we arrive on a crime scene, even a crime scene we suspect has been cleaned, which was the case there, we need a good light. We look for the presence of bloodstains at the bottom of the walls, between the edges of hardwood flooring, for example, at the bottom of doors, and anywhere that is hidden or dark. Often when bloodstains have been cleaned, it is done only as far as they can see and not on those places where it is dark. For example, on dark floors, dark furniture, cabinets, or cabinet toe kicks, sometimes you can find traces of blood. In this case, the visual search for blood was negative. I used a product called luminol, which in the dark emits a blue-green luminescence, but in the presence of blood, it becomes bright blue. I found 2 tiny spots of blood on the mattress. In fact, it was a brown substance which was at least partly blood. I then found 1 drop of blood on the door frame in the bathroom. So that's all I found. The rest of the apartment was free of bloodstains or spatter. And if there had been a large amount of blood spilled and the area had been cleaned, we still could have found the stains by using the luminol. But that's not necessarily true if it's been shampooed. The 2 spots on the mattress were about 2 centimeters in diameter, so small brown spots. The lab is located in Montreal, So we left Lancia and Lorette, and in the days that followed, I analyzed the bloodstains. I had them extracted to obtain DNA and then amplified them to get a genetic profile. I also took a blood sample from the victim for comparison. The 2 spots of blood on the mattress gave combinations of genetic profiles which were similar to what we would obtain if we took that man combined with the DNA profile of Tanya Panette. So there is a combination of a man and Tanya Panette, the same man who left his drop of blood against the door frame and the 2 spots on the mattress. So it was 2 small spots, but we could not confirm from these 2 spots that the crime happened there because we knew from the investigation that Tanya Panette slept there. It could have been menstruation blood, for example, which was not established. Following the analysis of the suspect's apartment, we could not conclude that there was a significant spill connected to the homicide or death of Tanya Panette.
For investigators, it's evident that the crime was committed at the Lorette River. Tanya's clothing returns from the Forensic Science Laboratory in Montreal.
Then the clothes were returned from the forensics lab. They were now dry and separated into individual bags. We then decided to search the pockets again. It was dry. It was easier now that we were not in the river or in the mud. So we opened the clothing, looking for small cuts that there could be on the clothes. We searched inside them and the pockets again. And in the pant pockets, I found 2 more pieces of balled up paper, now dry. Therefore, impossible to work with them.
Remy Doyon photographs the new evidence and classifies each exhibit. On May 17th, police conduct a second search, this time at the home of Jesse's mother, where he now lives.
We needed to recover all the clothes that were in Jesse Barrowie's possession. His coat, his boots, his pants, in the hopes of finding the victim's DNA.
Investigators also seize the knife Jesse has on his keychain and send it to the Laboratory of Forensic Science in Montreal.
Mrs. Prévost begins her forensic investigation.
I searched for blood on the clothing, boots, shoes. It was negative, and I made a report to that effect. Upon visual examination of the knife, there were no bloodstains. It was a small, retractable knife. You know, the kind of small Swiss Army knife with a blade and a file on one side, and scissors on the other side that you can fold into the structure of the handle. And the blade of the knife was similar in length and width to what the pathologist wrote in his report about the wounds on the right side of the victim's neck.
Will Jacinthe Prévost find the blood of Tanya Panette on the knife of Jesse Barrowie? Did Jesse do more than just utter death threats? The lifeless body of Tanya Panette is found in the Lorette River near Quebec City. A search of Jesse Barrowie's apartment, where he lived at the time of the crime, reveals no substantial bloodstains, indicating that the assault took place at the river. There was no trace of Tanya's blood on Jesse's clothing, but he remains a suspect in the case. Jacinthe Prévost analyzes Jesse's pocket knife in hopes of finding the victim's blood.
So I used the testing guidelines to detect the presence of blood, even if it is invisible to the eye. And there was a slight discoloration. I could detect the presence of a little bit of blood. I figured that the knife had maybe been washed. It makes sense. We can't see blood. It could be the right knife, but it's been washed. as there is a handle that allows the blade, file, and scissors to close up inside of it, I told myself that maybe it hadn't been washed thoroughly. By opening it, we might find blood if the knife did indeed have any on it at some point. So in opening the plastic knife handle, I found bits of dried blood, and it turned out to match the genetic profile of the victim. That's how investigators were able to link the knife from their suspect to the victim.
Le couteau de leur suspect avec la victime.
This is a major breakthrough for investigators, but they still must remove any possibility of doubt. In this case, there are no witnesses. Only the suspect knows the truth. When police interrogate him, they must be aware of every piece of evidence, direct or circumstantial. They must be able to demonstrate that they know the suspect is guilty. Meanwhile, Remy Doyon decides to re-examine the balls of paper found in Tanya's clothing following the autopsy.
I got up one morning and thought, I didn't pick those little balled up pieces of paper for nothing. I brought them to the laboratory and I put them in water so they would be soaked and I could reopen them without tearing or damaging them. And the next day, after being in water for 24 hours, I gently opened them with tweezers. I realized that these two pieces of paper went with the first bus transfer. They were two pieces of the transfer and completed it. We could now make out everything on the bus ticket. I didn't stick the pieces together, but assembled them in such a way that I could take a photograph of the entire ticket. I developed the photo and gave it to the investigator to add to his file. Then he immediately left with it.
We met people from the transit service who gave us the description of a bus ticket, a transfer, how it worked, why they punched holes where they did, and they told us that each driver had a unique hole punch. When you take the bus, you get your ticket punched. It can be a drawing, anything, but every driver has his unique punch.
Investigators meet with the bus driver who owns the hole punch, but he has no memory of Tanya.
It's unclear. I mean, we're in Quebec City and many people take the bus.
The important thing is that the bus ticket corroborates the statement of the woman in St. Roch who loaned Tanya clothes on the day she was last seen alive. It proves that on March 30th of last year, Tanya took the bus downtown in the direction of Lancienne-Lorette. Le Godard's strategy works. The trail is clear and leads directly to the murderer. The next element to be resolved is the carving on the tree.
L'histoire de l'arbre, d'abord, on se souvient.
We remember that initially, on the day we found the victim, I photographed a tree, a conifer that was easily 12 to 14 inches in diameter. In the picture, you could see a carving, which was perhaps 5 or 6 centimeters by 10 centimeters high.
During the investigation, we learned that Milio was a nickname he had. Finding that hard with the nickname of the suspect and the victim told us that they knew this area, which was very important in order to press charges.
After reviewing the photos, investigator Le Godard comes to see me and asks me if we can determine how long before the photograph was taken was the engraving done. I referred him to the University of Laval.
That's the first time in 34 years I had an autopsy done of a tree. I went to the Faculty of Forestry at Laval University and met with Guimond Ouellet, who is a forest pathologist. At that time, I had been retired since 1995, but I continued to work at the research center where I used to work before, so he explained the situation to me.
Along with Le Godard and Dion, Guimond Ouellet goes to La Sienne-Lorette to examine the tree.
There were a lot of these little black spots that we identified as being insects whose flight period is between mid-June and late July, which means that when they were in flight, there was already enough sap for them to get their feet caught in, and it was soft enough for them to get encrusted in it. If it was sap that had secreted the previous year, it would have hardened and the insects could not have gotten stuck, especially near the carving.
Guimond Ouellet wants to be doubly sure he's right. He pushes the experiment further.
We tried to imitate the carving on the tree just above the original carving. I made the sample carving in September, about September 15th, I think, to verify if an abundance of sap would flow in autumn on 2 or 3 areas of the tree.
And then he asked me to come and photograph that carving every day for the 10 days that followed. Each time I photographed it with the same kind of film, the same type of camera, and with almost the same distances. Although the distance was less important because they were instruments of measurement that I photographed at the same time as the wound.
The results of the tree's autopsy are one of the last elements needed for Le Godard to complete his investigation. The answer will tell him if the carving was made around the same time the murder occurred. Will the carving on the tree trunk contain the final clue he needs to solve Tanya's murder? In April 2000, Tanya Pinette is found drowned in the Lorette River near Quebec City. 8 small wounds were found on her neck, 2 of which punctured the carotid artery. Although no traces of Tanya's blood have been found either in her boyfriend's apartment or on his clothing, it was discovered on his pocket knife. Forest pathologist Guimond Ouellet conducts tests on the tree trunk on which the suspect's nickname and the initials of the victim were carved. His primary objective is to determine when the carving was made.
So, on the side of the tree that had no carving, there was no sap. Now, in the sample carving I made, there was sap, but not in abundance, so it showed that during the fall, there shouldn't be much sap flow. I couldn't establish an exact date, but for sure it couldn't be traced back to the previous fall.
This demonstrates that the carving was made at about the same time the murder occurred. For Le Godard, this represents a step in the right direction in his pursuit of Tanya's killer.
From the outset of the investigation, after the autopsy, our suspect was already targeted. With his history of violence, the threats he had made to the victim, and the knife we had seen in his possession, he was the prime suspect. We must proceed with the interrogation of the suspect, but before we meet him, we try to eliminate all other possibilities. Because for this murder, we have no witnesses. You've got the victim, who can't speak anymore, and then there's only the accused who can tell what really happened. So we eliminated all the possibilities that there could be anyone else who killed the victim.
Investigators, along with the prosecution, prepare to arrest the suspect.
We explain our evidence to him, and he confirms that we can make an arrest without a warrant. We have good reason to believe that he committed a crime. Once the entire investigation was finished, we had to seek assistance from 2 detectives from the provincial police who in 2000 were specialists in video interrogation. So we had to prepare these two investigators, and once they had all the details of the file, we proceeded to the arrest.
On May 11th, 2001, more than a year after the investigation began, Jesse Barrowy is arrested for the murder of Tanya Pinette.
He had no reaction. We read him his right to silence and to an attorney, and he was transported to the Quebec Provincial Police offices for questioning. One of the investigators interrogates the suspect, and a backup investigator is outside and sees the whole interview and takes notes. And during the interrogation, there may be a change of investigator to continue the questioning. He sees only one investigator, but he knows that there's another investigator on the other side of the window watching him and taking notes.
Before the interview begins, Jesse is informed of his rights.
The interrogation lasted about 10 hours. And after that, the suspect sort of broke down. He asked to return to the interrogation room because he wanted to tell them what happened on the day of the murder. They cautioned him, saying, if you wish to tell me about the murder of the victim, you can, but you have the right to call your lawyer first. He said no. He didn't want to call his lawyer anymore. He wanted to recount what happened. He said they had visited the riverbank at the place where we found the heart that was carved in the tree. It was a place where they liked to be together because he was in love with her, he said. There, Jesse, the suspect, had a fit of jealousy. He accused the victim of being a prostitute. She wasn't having any of it. She tried to slap him, and he says they argued. To use his words, he freaked out. He opened the knife and stabbed her in the throat. Subsequently, he says the victim was crawling away and he left the scene. He never admitted pulling her into the river. He never tried to find out if she needed help, and he didn't want to explain more than that. He said it happened on the riverside where they swore their love to each other. It happened there. He said he left the scene and returned 2 days later to try to find a chain that he'd lost during the fight with the victim. He said he found the chain at the scene. If he hadn't returned, we would have found it because we had searched the riverbanks with a metal detector. He said he didn't see the body. The body must have been moved by the stream.
Following the confession, investigators have 24 hours to bring the accused before a judge.
The accused was taken to court the following day on the charge of second-degree murder. Because premeditation must be proven for first-degree murder, and in this case, there was no premeditation. There was no evidence to prove that. The suspect was indicted and pleaded guilty, and there was never a trial.
Jesse Barrowy receives a prison sentence of 11 years for the murder of Tanya Pinette. Water almost erased his crime, but thanks to the excellent work of the investigators, the murder was exposed and justice was served. Innisfil, Ontario is a bedroom community 70 kilometers north of Toronto. a quiet recreation town on the edge of Lake Simcoe. On the afternoon of April 25, 1996, a man walks along a trail at Innisfil Beach Park. He notices splashing in the water about 100 meters from the shore. In the distance, a red canoe drifts away. He suddenly sees someone in danger of drowning, clinging desperately to a floating patch of ice. He calls for help. At first glance, this seems like an unfortunate end to a simple canoe ride on Lake Simcoe. However, appearances can be deceiving. Will investigators find they are piecing together a series of tragic errors made by a calculating mind?
It's unusual to have someone out on the lake at that time of year when the ice is still so close to the shore.
15 minutes after receiving the 911 call, Innisfil Fire Rescue arrives at Alcona Park. Their rescue boat is still stored for the winter, so the paramedics must get to the victim in a rowboat.
The water temperature at the time was 4 degrees Celsius, and there was still ice out on the lake.
The rescuers reached the man nearly 45 minutes after the 911 call was placed. He is severely hypothermic and unable to speak.
One of the fire rescuers at the scene actually asked him to blink once for no, twice for yes. Was there anyone in the canoe with you? And he didn't respond.
There are no signs of any other victims, so they return to shore. Alive but unresponsive, the man is rushed to the Royal Victoria Hospital in nearby Barrie, Ontario. Rescuers identify the victim as Winston Malcolm and find his address. The fire rescue team briefs Innisfil police with the victim's name and the few details they have of the incident. Officers then pay a visit to Mr. Malcolm's home to notify any relatives.
They went to the residence to notify Jan that Winston had been in this situation. She wasn't home, and that caused them some concern.
Several hours later, Winston begins to regain consciousness in the hospital. In a delirious state, he calls for his wife, Jan Marshall. He asks the nurse if Jan is alive. Knowing that Winston was brought in alone, the nurse immediately contacts police.
He indicated that he and his wife went out for a canoe trip just to practice their skills, and that his wife was laying in the bottom of the canoe because she was cold. She was covered up with a sleeping bag, and they paddled back and forth. And at one point, they became lodged on some ice. They both tried to extricate themselves by use of the paddles, pushing off on the ice floe, at which time the canoe capsized, throwing them both into the water.
Police already know there was nobody home at Mr. Malcolm's house. They fear Jan Marshall might still be at the lake. That same evening, police and fire rescue return to search Lake Simcoe. They scan the water and the shoreline at Alcona Beach Park where Winston was found. There is no sign of Jan Marshall. Darkness falls and the search is called off until morning.
It was a missing person case. Had she made it to shore? Was she somewhere along shore? Had she succumbed to the water and drowned? They had no idea.
The following morning, on April 26th, Detective Inspector Ron Gentle coordinates a recovery team. He calls in the Ontario Provincial Police Dive Unit to begin searching for the body of Jan Marshall.
At the time, I was approximately 4 hours away, so it took a good portion of the day to pack up and to respond to the call.
Detective Sergeant Tom McDonald dispatches officers to attend the scene and question witnesses.
We had several witnesses from shore who saw the gentleman in the canoe. Starting at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, he was observed. And throughout the course of the day, right up until the time that the canoe capsized at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon.
It appeared that the canoeist was paddling just up and down along the ice, and as it would slowly move out, he kept paddling just up and down, going into deeper and deeper water as the ice floe moved out. None of the witnesses, and I think there were 6 or 7, that watched from time to time from shore, saw the canoe on the ice, saw the canoe in distress. You know, they saw him and only he. They never saw Jan. They thought there was just one person in the canoe.
Suspicions arise as the hope of finding Jan Marshall alive begins to fade. Dead or alive, she must be found in order for the investigation to proceed.
We were told our inspector was going to be attending the scene because there was rather some suspicion of foul play. Just accumulation of the time of year, being out in a canoe with the ice still on the water, and the flags were up. So that's, I think, when we first thought that we're going to be a little more prudent with the collection of evidence on this one. We just were given a primary target location, and we went out and searched it.
The dive team starts from the public dock at Alcona Beach. The initial search area is 100 by 150 meters, and the water temperature is 4 degrees Celsius. The divers use a technique called sledding, which allows them to search a large area of the frigid lake very quickly.
We dive in pairs, so basically 2 planing boards, a diver on each board being pulled with the vessel making way. It's attached with rope to the back of the boat, and the divers can manipulate the board, tilt it up if they want to go up, tilt down, sideways. It's, you know, the versatility of the board. You can do anything you want. Communicate with the boat operator if you want to speed up or slow down. And we cover such a large area using the sleds. In this lake, Lake Simco, the visibility was 15 feet. So with 2 divers, you're covering a good swath, at least a 20-foot swath with the sleds.
The divers come up empty-handed.
The ice would come in closer to shore some days, and the wind would blow it out further. So we didn't have a specific search area, and so we did the best we could with what the information we had at the time.
There's very few reference points when you look out into the water. You can't say, you know, it's right next to that telephone pole. It's 300 yards out, and you know, you go which way a couple degrees, and you could be talking, you know, hundreds of feet.
There's just enough time for one more dive before darkness forces the team to stop. Will they find the body of Jan Marshall? In April 1996, a man is rescued from Lake Simcoe, Ontario. His canoe had capsized, leaving him hypothermic in the frigid waters and unable to speak. Several hours after being admitted to the hospital, he informs a nurse that his common-law wife, Jan, was also in the canoe. Divers from the Ontario Provincial Police have been called in to assist the search. They do 2 dives on the first day.
The first day, we just were given a primary target location, and we went out and searched it, and there was no luck in locating any debris from the capsized canoe or the victim.
On April 27th, the underwater search resumes, this time more intensely with an expanded search area.
We're equipped with wireless communications, so the divers had the ability to communicate with each other as well as communicating with the boat operator. And so we just took turns rotating through the cycle of diving, and the water depths out there, they didn't exceed 35 feet. We didn't have the tools of the GPS at the time in '96, so we physically went out and we placed markers. And the boat operator, he's got an area to maintain. It's some whether you want to call it a Zamboni style of searching. They just eliminate certain areas and just expand from there.
Meanwhile, investigators talk with members of Jan's family.
And she'd actually been out to BC to visit her mother just weeks prior. Had told her mother that she was considering moving out to BC and leaving Winston.
Could this suggest a possible motive for Jan's disappearance? Investigators look for more clues by comparing witness statements to those of Winston Malcolm. Winston's first statement is about why he and Jan were canoeing on icy Lake Simco at that time of year.
The reason that he provided for being on a lake was that he had a upcoming canoe trip planned in Algonquin Park for the May 2nd weekend. He indicated that he and his wife went out for a canoe trip just to practice their skills. The story Mr. Malcolm gave us was that he lowered the canoe onto the car and she walked ahead, and he picked her up en route. And when he picked her up, she complained about being chilly. And he unloaded the canoe at the waterfront, put it in the water, and she laid in the canoe, and he went and parked the car. He came back and put a sleeping bag over top of her, and then he pushed off and he paddled. She didn't paddle at all. Now, I'm not an avid canoeist, but I'm an outdoors person, and I have canoed. And I can't imagine somebody laying in the bottom of an uninsulated canoe if you're chilled. I just find that would be a little cold. And her family were able to tell us that she had just recovered from pneumonia. She suffered late in the winter as well. So those two facts didn't make a whole lot of sense to us as well.
But none of the witnesses saw Jan at the scene. Is it possible that she never got into the canoe in the first place?
Witnesses from the shore said the canoe was sitting steady in the water, even. Whereas if you have a 200-plus pound man and a woman at the back of the canoe, because he described her laying in the bottom with her head on his knees, one would think the canoe would be tipped, obviously, to the rear, and nobody saw that. So the displacement that was described by the witnesses on shore and the positioning of the two bodies in the canoe, as he described it, didn't make any sense as well.
Curiously, the witnesses did not actually see the canoe capsize. In two separate statements made to the police about the accident, Winston contradicts himself.
He gave two versions once again. One was that they got hung up on the ice, that he paddled onto the ice and asked her to help shove off, and that the two of them shoved off from the same side and the canoe capsized. And another version is that she got up to paddle and somehow off-balanced the canoe. So once again, it goes back to his statements. None of the witnesses, and I think there were 6 or 7, that watched from time to time from shore, saw the canoe on the ice, saw the canoe in distress. They saw him and only he. They never saw Jan. They thought there was just one person in the canoe.
On the second day of the search, the dive team conducts 2 more unsuccessful dives. They are desperate to pinpoint the location where the canoe capsized. That same day, Winston is released from the hospital. Officers then pay a visit to ask him for help to find Jan.
We asked if he could return to the site, and it would greatly assist our search if he could come out in the boat, in the vessel, and give us a location where he suspected it occurred.
The team does their third and final dive of the day. But once again, the frigid water of Lake Simcoe refuses to divulge its secret.
Depending on the length of time that he was in the water, the survivor, he could have drifted quite a ways. Lake Simcoe is a large area, body of water, and he could drift quite a ways with the wind and the wave action. And he put us out in left field, totally out of the picture. But that was the area he identified. So our third dive that day, we searched it and there was nothing.
detectives begin to speculate. Was Winston's memory of the accident blurred, or did he intentionally put them on the wrong track? The dive team will spend one more day searching for Jan Marshall. To maximize their chances of finding her body, they turn to an unlikely source for help. The canoe that Winston Malcolm was paddling capsized on Lake Simco, Ontario. Rescuers managed to save him, but there is still no sign of his common-law wife, Jan Marshall. By this point, suspicions run high, but investigators still do not have enough evidence to know if they are dealing with an accident or a crime. On April 28th, the OPP dive team prepares for a third day of searching for Jan's body, but they struggle to find the spot where Winston capsized his canoe.
Yeah, we had aerial photographs of the shoreline, and we tried as best we could to pinpoint where the body was located, or where the mishap had occurred as far as the capsizing of the canoe. We even considered using, at one point, satellite images.
The dive team turns to the local news media that covered Winston's rescue. They hope something was captured on videotape.
The information came forward that when the fire department were out making the rescue, there was a cameraman on shore with the local television network. So we were able to track down the video that he took, the footage, plus the cameraman himself. He attended the scene and he was able to give us the exact location where he was standing, and the shot that he took communicated with a boat that was out on the water. We directed them into the location and they dropped a marker, and then we concentrated around that marker.
The dive team finally has a precise idea as to where they should look. Will they find the victim?
And on the third day, we conducted the first dive. And 15 minutes into the dive, we located the victim. The victim was lying on her left side she was wearing a dark-colored bomber-style jacket. It was up over her head. She was wearing brown pants with light-colored socks. She had no footwear, which was in itself suspicious. There was a coil of rope suspended above her, and it appeared to be looped through her belt loop on the back of her pants. And her hands were free. There was nothing in her hands. Once she was located, I placed our pelican marker, which was just a weight. I tied it to her right ankle, and the marker surfaced. I followed the marker to the surface, making sure that it was unraveling all the way up, and notified the members in the boat of my discovery. And I was also informed then that my partner, Larry Scott, had located a patio stone.
The dive team feels a sense of relief, both for Jan Marshall's family and for the detectives who can now proceed with the investigation.
They came up to the surface and notified us, and we asked them, when they came back and briefed us, to take the video equipment down and to film the scene, because it was our body recovery scene. And that is usually one of the largest pieces of evidence we have in any investigation, any death investigation.
Well, like the old saying goes, a picture's worth 1,000 words. When it comes to court, it saves a lot of time on the stand trying to describe a scene. And again, it's subject to interpretation of what the member says. So it's nice that we can play the videotape in the courtroom, and this is exactly the way we found it, and no questions asked. And the plan was we were to return, videotape as much evidence as possible, return to the dock, unload the camera, take it back to the South Simco Police Service office, where the tape was to be reviewed prior to disturbing the scene. That would allow us that if there was any area that they wanted focused, that we could return, and everything was untouched, we can go back down and videotape it. Plus, it would allow the silt to settle from the initial videotaping. Then we, together, the investigators, the divers, and the forensic identification people,
we sat down and viewed the video and came up with a game plan on how we were going to proceed. So I got a good look at the watered scene. And what was unique about this is that the lake bottom was purely sand. And there was no vegetation, there were no rocks. And then suddenly there's this patio stone. There was no algae on it, there was no buildup of anything at all. It seemed obviously out of place.
Until everyone is satisfied that the videotape has accurately captured the scene, the evidence remains untouched. Then the divers begin the recovery.
The victim was removed from the bottom 35 feet down. We lowered a cage, Stokes cage basket next to the body. She was placed into the Stokes, and the divers assisted raising the body.
In this case, she was brought up with bags on her hands and over her head in the Stokes basket, and she was put into a funeral body bag once she got to the surface. And then that way the coroner reviewed her pronounced death, and then she was put in the body bag.
Once the body is in the boat, the team notices signs of trauma on Jan's forehead. Could it have been caused by foul play?
Could it have come from the canoe? Could it have come from the paddle? Could it have come from the ice? You know, we just weren't sure.
The victim is transported to the morgue. The patio stone and other evidence are taken to the forensic identification lab for testing.
I asked the divers to go back and take several water samples from the lake, from the surface of the lake, mid-level, and from the bottom of the lake as well. Diatoms are small microscopic organisms that are unique to each body of water.
If the autopsy finds that Jan died by drowning, the diatoms from the water samples will be compared to diatoms found in her tissue samples. If they match, it will prove that Jan drowned in Lake Simco.
Those are important in drowning deaths to help us determine ensure that the water the body is found in is the water that they were drowned in.
The next day, the divers return and videotape a larger area around the scene to make sure they did not miss anything that could be used as evidence. They make a few more discoveries.
There was a hiking-style backpack, which was large enough to accommodate the patio stone. There was one female shoe. There was a bungee cord, and I believe that was it.
The divers are satisfied that they have recovered all the evidence from Lake Simco. Now it's up to the investigative team to piece it all together. Suspicions are high around the circumstances of Jan Marshall's death. The evidence collected is pointing toward a cover-up. Will the autopsy uncover evidence that turns this canoeing accident into a homicide? Winston Malcolm has survived frigid waters in a canoe accident on Lake Simcoe, Ontario. Jan Marshall, his common-law wife, has suffered a different fate. Jan's body has been found in the lake along with a cement stone and a backpack. Detective Sergeant Tom McDonald is responsible for delivering the tragic news to Winston. Mr. Malcolm's reaction is rather unemotional.
I think he asked if they recovered the canoe, if I'm not mistaken. I believe that's what he asked.
As the detectives leave Winston's house, something catches their attention.
Detective Buchanan observed a location on his walkway where a patio stone had been freshly lifted. It left an impression in the ground, the same approximate size of the patio stone.
So obviously, that connection, although we still had to prove the patio stone came from his residence, that was certainly enough to raise our suspicions.
The investigators must resist jumping to conclusions and focus on building a strong case.
Post-mortem hadn't been done yet, so we still didn't know the cause of death. The fact that Mr. Malcolm had told the police officer who went to the hospital Thursday night that Jan was wearing big rubber boots, and the next day he had told Tom McDonald that she was wearing small shoes, to find her shoeless in the water certainly caused us some concern as well. And of course, we'd also known at that point in time that Jan had told Winston that she wasn't happy and that she was going to end the relationship. And she told family members that she planned on leaving by the end of May.
As the events unfolded, we discovered rather quickly that the story that Mr. Malcolm had provided was crumbling. Nothing he said was consistent with what we discovered to be the truth.
Investigators believe there is sufficient evidence to arrest Winston.
Now remember, our grounds to arrest don't have to be to the extent that we could convict in court. We just have to have reasonable probable grounds to believe that he committed the offense. And so we can arrest on a weaker level of proof than we'd need to convict him in court. It was our belief that she'd been killed in the home and transported from the home to Lake Simco, where her body was disposed of, and that in pushing the body overside, Canoe is not a very stable vessel to be putting anything large in and throwing it overboard. And we theorized that in the action of throwing her overboard, he capsized the canoe. But our fear was that Mr. Malcolm was certainly a wise man and would know that we were probably theorizing what had taken place, and we were afraid he's going to destroy evidence. So our thoughts were to arrest him, place him in custody, get our search warrant, knowing that we've protected our evidence now. We seized the scene, secured the scene to make sure nobody could tamper with anything, and put our search warrant together.
On Sunday, April 28th, 3 days after the alleged accident, Detective Sergeant Tom McDonald arrests Winston Malcolm for the first-degree murder of Jan Marshall.
Mr. Malcolm's demeanor at the time was fairly quiet. He was passive and showed little emotion.
On Monday, the pathologist begins the autopsy of the victim. Forensic Identification Officer Scott McLeod is present.
The autopsy was held in Toronto at the coroner's building. My job would be to record the autopsy, so I would take still photographs at that time and collect any evidence that was recovered from her, including all her clothing. Her body was in good condition. There was no decomposition. The water was like being in the bathtub too long. Hands were a little wrinkled, but she was in good condition.
There was obvious signs of trauma and bruising to the neck area, which caused some bruising to the trachea and the hyoid area. She had been manually strangled, which caused the bruising and the petechial hemorrhaging. Strangled to the point that she was rendered unconscious, but not deceased. And then the lake finished the job. The pathologist, Dr. Sepp, believed that death was due to drowning. She was not dead when she entered the water. And that she had suffered petechial hemorrhaging to both eyelids and eyes.
The autopsy reveals that Jan's death is due to more than just a canoeing accident. Did Winston accidentally strangle Jan during a fight? Did he panic when he thought he had killed her and threw her into the lake to hide her body? Or did he plan all along to render her unconscious and dump her body in Lake Simco to make it look like an accidental drowning?
In addition to the standard post-mortem, there was a diatom test that was performed by the coroner to indicate in which body of water Jan had died.
The results conclude that Jan did indeed drown in Lake Simco. Deep bruising found on her left shoulder blade is consistent with injuries that could have been made by dragging the body by the arms. The investigators want to determine how long the victim was unconscious before she took her last breath beneath the surface of Lake Simco. To determine when the assault occurred, the coroner orders a brain scan.
If she'd been unconscious for an extended period of time, usually 6, 8, 9 hours at least, somewhere in that range, that may be shown in those brain slides, which would then give us an indication on how long maybe before her body was deposited, because we knew for 5 hours that she was in that canoe, probably unconscious. So how long before 11 a.m. Had the altercation taken place where she was rendered unconscious? So that would help us narrow down the time of the event and help us focus on gathering evidence there. So he did take slides of the brain, and they were sent away, but they came back inconclusive.
The brain scan was inconclusive, but the results from the post-mortem provide police with even more evidence to support their theory and charges.
Back in the mid-90s, the law was a lot different back then. However, a warrant to arrest, a police officer can arrest a person on reasonable probable grounds that they've committed an indictable offense, which we certainly had at that point in time. Grounds for search are an awful lot more onerous in that we have to be able to identify what crime has taken place, where it may have taken place, what evidence we hope to find in the place we want to search, and we have to be specific.
Police then proceed to search the home of Jan and Winston.
My focus is first on recording the scene without disrupting anything. Second, I'm then looking for anything that may be on the warrant while I'm doing my photography or my videography. That's pretty well where my focus is the whole time I'm there. I don't tend to think of how people lived or why items may be in the house or not. My focus is on whether it may be relevant to the investigation. There are times when you may find something on the premise that's not listed on the warrant. If it's relevant to your case, you can seize it. It just has to be brought before a justice after the search warrant has been completed, and the seizure has to be justified. If the justice is satisfied with that, then you've legally obtained that item.
One such object is an empty bottle of tranquilizers. Is this a relevant factor in the investigation? Once filming and photographing are complete, the forensic identification technician draws a map of the home.
In this case, we did. It was a two-story brick and aluminum home, and we did a scale diagram of the main, well, all 3 floors, the main floor, the bedroom floor, and the basement.
Based on evidence found at the crime scene, Scott McLeod makes a special effort to look for corroborating evidence.
She was found with a section of yellow nylon rope loosely attached to her. So we would be interested to know whether there's any yellow nylon rope somewhere on the house premises. Very close by to her, on the bottom of the lake, was a patio stone. Near the rear of the house. The very last position where a patio stone should have been, there was a stone missing.
So we made a plaster cast of that so that we could show definitively that that patio stone was taken from that spot outside Mr. Malcolm's home.
There was a car. It was fairly close to the steps leading into the house. After it was photographed, we took tapings from within the car. And what a taping is merely taking normal Scotch tape, wrapping it around your hand and and touching the back of, for instance, the back of the car seat. And then we'll do several of those from within the car. We also took tapings from the trunk of the car. Once that was done, we actually took the trunk liner as a piece of evidence. Both of them shared that vehicle, so to find a hair in the trunk would not have been overly significant. Finding a broken hair or a hair with a root may have been a little more significant. A little more weight could have been put on it as to how the hair would have removed from her head.
McLeod hopes to find proof that Winston moved Jan's bruised and unconscious body to the lake in the trunk of the car.
Reports from the Center for Forensic Sciences showed that there were microscopically similar fibers on her clothing as were found in the trunk liner. The working theory was that that's how she was transported to the lake, and that's why we took the trunk liner to see whether there was hair and fibers that would match her clothing and vice versa.
10 days later, Winston's red canoe is recovered. Hopefully, it will reveal more clues about the tragic circumstances of Jan Marshall's death. The body of Jan Marshall is found in Lake Simco, Ontario. Her husband, Winston Malcolm, claims his wife capsized the canoe, throwing them both into the frigid water. Witness statements contradict Winston's story. After the discovery of important evidence, they arrest him for the murder of his wife. The canoe, which had drifted away, has just been found.
The canoe was red in color, and it was located in Big Bay Point, approximately 4 or 5 miles from the location. So we had put out alerts through the media indicating that we were looking for this canoe, and a cottager had actually found it.
I ended up going to the Innisfil Police Service and took general photographs of the recovered canoe. I did examine the inside to see whether there'd be any major scratches or something that couldn't be explained through normal use, and I didn't find anything.
The investigation draws to a close, except for one final search, which proves to be revealing.
We did a search warrant on the hospital and seized the medical records, and it was located there that he had an highly elevated level of a certain prescription drug in his system, which was way beyond therapeutic range.
In a statement made to his lawyer, Winston said he had ingested 30 tablets of clonazepam in an attempt to take his own life. Investigators try to put together the series of events that took place April 25th, 1996.
We believe that he thought he'd killed her. There was indications that after the violent act in the house, that he took a large number of prescription pills in an attempt to take his own life. That obviously didn't work. And then he decided that he had to find something to do with the body. And he came up with the canoe and disposing the body in the lake. And I think his story was going to be that she had planning to leave. She had indeed left, and he hasn't seen or heard of her. And when he capsized, I think the plan went awry. When he first put in, the witnesses tell us the ice floe was 30 to 40 feet offshore, and by 4 p.m. it was close to 300 yards offshore. So we theorized that he was waiting for water to be deep enough that he could dispose of the body safely. Our theory was that she was in the sleeping bag. That helped him hide the body from sight, and that the patio stone and rope were tied to her in the sleeping bag, and that when he threw her overboard, her body came out of the sleeping bag, and the sleeping bag remained on the surface, and her body sunk to the bottom with the stone. Those nylon ropes aren't really good at holding a knot. And so we theorized that the patio stone, probably the knot came undone and the cord came off the patio stone and just hung there in her belt loop.
Investigators have everything they need to prepare for trial.
Well, the next stage in the investigation, of course, is the coordination of all the statements and evidence that you have acquired and getting the accused properly before the courts. A preliminary hearing was scheduled shortly thereafter. It lasted approximately 3 weeks.
We provide the Crown with our investigation, and we went through with them. We explained the evidence we had, the key witnesses. We gave them a copy of our entire investigative brief, and it's kind of a way for the defense also to see just what the evidence is. Of course, we make full disclosure, but they also get to see just how good the witnesses are, and for the Crown to also choose and make sure that the witnesses and the evidence are solid. But it's mostly for the judge to determine that, yes, this is the right charge, they have the evidence to support it, and this trial is worthy to go on to a full trial. We thought we had a good case for First, but First is very difficult to prove, obviously, in situations like this. But he would have had to explain. I believe personally that he would have had to have taken the stand to explain the contradictory statements he made to witnesses and the police. So I think that would have been a tough one for him to get over.
Winston pleads guilty to second-degree murder. His lawyer knows the prosecution cannot prove premeditation, which is essential for a first-degree murder charge.
We believed that at that time, with the information that we had, that it was planned and deliberate. However, we know that unfortunate domestic situations sometimes can get out of hand. Marshall had a bruising on the forehead. We believe she was hit with something. And there was some blunt trauma to the forehead, a manual strangulation. There was other bruising to her elbows. So there were signs of a struggle or signs of violence, not unlike a domestic situation or a physical altercation.
On April 10, 1997, Winston Malcolm is convicted of the second-degree murder of Jan Marshall. He receives a 25-year sentence and is eligible for parole after having served a minimum of 10 years in a penitentiary. The investigating team is satisfied with the sentence.
The role that water played in this investigation was, unfortunately, a means of disposing of a body. Ultimately, the cause of death for Jan was drowning. So it played a very big part in her demise.
It struck me in that the water killed Jan, yet that wasn't the intent of Winston. His intent was to use the water, as it so often is, to hide a crime or to cover a crime. And it actually helped him commit the crime. He thought he'd killed her, and he hadn't. And so the water did the job for him.
We may never know for sure if Winston Malcolm intended to kill Jan Marshall. But one thing is certain. The waters of Lake Simcoe ultimately served as the perfect murder weapon. In the Pacific Northwest, along the southern coast of British Columbia, lies the picturesque Strait of Georgia. This will be the stage for the gruesome discoveries of 7 disarticulated human feet. All of these feet, encased in running shoes, will be given over to the authorities over a period of 2 years. This case will baffle the authorities and scientists for years to come and will capture the interest of the international press. On August 20th, 2007, a young girl and her family are visiting British Columbia. On the beach of Jedediah Island, a girl notices several running shoes. She picks one up. Pulling on the sock that is still inside, she is surprised to see that it contains a human foot. She calls out to her family, who immediately alert the police. In these coastal regions, civil protection is provided by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who treat these cases as any other suspicious matter. Annie Linto is the RCMP spokesperson.
Obviously, we arrive on the scene. We use the laboratory for forensic identification. They search the scene and write a report. They take photographs and video of the scene. Then our investigators also search along the shore and talk to witnesses, etc.
But the police do not find another foot, or the body of a victim who could help them understand how the foot has wound up there. Less than a week later, about 50 kilometers south on Gabriola Island, a couple is on a hike along the ocean. Suddenly, they notice a running shoe with the laces still tied. They turn it up and see a bone sticking out of the shoe. The couple immediately called the police. At a press conference, the RCMP report what little they know at the time. There were 2 right feet found, and both are in men's size 12 running shoes. According to the investigators, the probability of finding 2 feet of the same size is very low. The police invite the public to contact them if they have any information concerning the case. The story spreads quickly through the media, and the imagination of the public explodes. Questions arise. Who did the feet belong to? Why did they end up on these islands? How did they become separated from the rest of the body? Are they linked to a single event? A plane crash or a boating accident, perhaps? Or worse, could they be victims of a crime whose bodies have been cut up and thrown in the water?
We received about a dozen calls, but they were mostly theories about what they thought might have happened. People seem to have a morbid fascination as to the origin of these feet. The first thing we must do is to identify the victim. It's the first step. Then the identification will show us a bit more whether or not we must pursue a criminal investigation.
The RCMP transfer the 2 right feet to the BC Coroner's Office. The office is responsible for a completely different aspect of this investigation and tries by various scientific means to extract the maximum amount of information from these mysterious feet.
The police departments are involved in a fault-finding process. They're looking for criminal activity. They're investigating the potential of a crime, whereas the coroner service are involved in a fact-finding investigation. So we're responsible not only for the identification of the decedent, but also when they died, where they died, how they died, and by what means. We classify that death as either natural, suicide, accident, homicide, or undetermined. If you've only got a foot, why is it that you only have a foot? And the pathologist can sometimes help with that by determining whether there's any evidence of trauma, if there's any mechanical removal of that foot from the rest of the body. When a foot is found in a shoe on the beach, there's not a lot that we know about it immediately, and we're certain that's what the investigation is all about. And from there on, we'd use a number of different experts. An anthropologist might be really valuable. There may be bugs within the sock. So if there's insects, perhaps an entomologist might be useful to help us.
How quickly a body decomposes depends on where it is and the types of organisms that attack it. The coroner enlists the services of Dr. Gail Anderson, who researches human decomposition.
I've been working in forensic entomology now for over 20 years, and whenever I speak to police officers, I've been able to show the kind of research I do and how it works in an actual homicide investigation. But they would always ask, yes, but what happens when a body's in the water? And it became very frustrating not to be able to answer that question. So we started looking at carcasses, animal carcasses. first of all in fresh water, and then now more recently in the marine environment. We've always used pig carcasses in forensic entomology. They're considered to be a very good mimic for human decomposition. Obviously, it's much more difficult to use human bodies, so pig carcasses make a good replication for humans. Pigs are roughly the same size as the adult human torso, so this is where most of the decomposition is taking place in a human being, with the face and the head and the gut region. And so a pig, if we get the right size pig, roughly mimics that. My main interest in looking at bodies in water is to look at the animals that scavenge or feed on the body. As a forensic entomologist on land, I look at the insects that colonize a body over time and use that to estimate how long that person's been dead. So in the water, I'm trying to do the same sort of thing, only there I'm not looking really at insects, I'm looking at their family members, they're the same sort of group. We're looking at the arthropods, so crabs, shrimp, things like that. We do know of situations where bodies, we know they only went into the water a few days before and they're almost skeletonized when we find them. That's one of the problems of the ocean. When you look at research on land, you can say, well, research conducted in this area is going to be very similar to research conducted in this area because geographically they're very similar, they've got the same kind of plants, meteorological conditions and things. But in the ocean, the situation changes within a few meters. In my shallow experiments, I found that carcasses that rotted on rock were very different from those that rotted on sand, even a few meters apart.
The coroner's office also enlists the services of a DNA expert to gain insight on this strange case.
Well, once the autopsy is complete, that's when we look at extracting a DNA sample. That sample would be submitted to a lab, and they may have to try a number of times to actually generate a profile. Just because we have a sample doesn't mean we're going to get DNA. There's a big challenge with developing DNA profiles from degraded remains.
Investigators call on the Department of Forensic Science at the BC Institute of Technology.
Moisture can be detrimental to DNA because it does facilitate the growth of microbes, bacteria, and fungus. So it just allows those things to infiltrate a sample and excrete these enzymes called nucleases, which is what degrades the DNA and makes it unusable. But as you decompose, that soft tissue will break down, and along with that would be the breakdown of the DNA. So what you want to do is go after the hard tissues in a difficult case, because the hard tissue lasts longer and therefore protects the DNA inside the hard tissue. Retesting is something we have to do if we're not successful the first time around. So sometimes we'll go back and get a larger sampling of the bone because DNA doesn't degrade consistently throughout the body. Some bones may have nothing, other bones may still have a trace of DNA.
While specialists examine the feet for clues to their origins, the RCMP begin looking at events that could have caused the death of the victims. They start with all accidents over the past years that occurred in or around the water on the south coast of British Columbia.
But we also looked at all incidents, like boats that may have sunk, or maybe planes that crashed. One incident in particular is that in 2005, there was a plane crash at Quadra Island, and it is assumed that the passengers were killed and were never found.
In 2005, 5 men board a float plane for what should be a routine trip to a logging camp up the BC coast. They take off from Camel River in the morning mist and are never heard from again. For 2 days, volunteers and authorities search by boat and helicopter, but find nothing. On the 3rd day, the body of only one of the passengers washes up on Quadra Island. Five months later, the plane is recovered from 240 meters underwater. Sadly, the pilot and the 3 other passengers are not on board. 2 years after the plane crash, the families of the missing men hear about the feet washing ashore only 100 kilometers away. Their hopes are sparked, and they eagerly give DNA samples to the RCMP and anxiously await the results. They'll be compared with the profiles from the found remains.
Well, we know that in your DNA profile, we have to see a match to your mom and dad. Now, if we use your brother or sister, statistically, you're more likely to share components, but you don't have to. So it makes it a lot more difficult to use siblings, particularly if you've only got one sibling. It can get a little bit better if you have multiple siblings, because you can put all the information together.
Will the test results show a connection between the feet found on Jedediah and Gabriola Islands and the victims of the crash? In August 2007, in British Columbia's Strait of Georgia, tourists make two separate discoveries of running shoes containing human right feet. Only 50 kilometers separate the two islands where the gruesome discoveries are made. The RCMP and the coroner's office collaborate. They rely on many experts to help them explain the discoveries. On February 8, 2008, two foresters find another right foot buried in a running shoe. This shocking discovery is on Valdez Island, about 10 kilometers from Gabriola Island, where the second foot was found. That makes 3 men's right feet in less than 6 months.
After the discovery of the second foot, we were a little curious. Maybe it was a coincidence. But after the third, we were very curious. It is a bit strange. So the police started an investigation that was a little bit more integrated.
But it's not unusual to find incomplete body parts. I mean, that is not something that, that would shock us. We found with the unit specifically that I manage, we have up to 60% of our cases that are incomplete. So finding incomplete bodies is not unusual. It's just that these feet and shoes were found in a short span of time.
The public is anxious to know the identity of the remains. Speculations continue to rise. Do the feet belong to the victims of the Quadra Island plane crash? Or do they belong to victims of a completely different accident? The coroner has determined that there is no evidence of trauma or mechanical removal of the feet from the rest of the body. So how did the feet become disembodied?
It's a very natural situation for the body to disarticulate as it breaks down. First of all, through the scavenging of the tissue that holds you together, then eventually by breaking up the cartilage, eating the cartilage, and completely disarticulating the body. If any of those body parts are attached to something that's a natural flotation device, like for instance a running shoe, then it would be quite natural for it to rise to the surface, just like your bloated body would, and then potentially with the tides and currents be washed ashore.
In spite of these facts, the investigators need to know when the victims died and were put in the water. But water can influence decomposition of a body in many ways.
Well, water temperature certainly affects the decomposition of the body in water, as it does on land. And in general, the water temperature is a lot cooler, and certainly it is here in the Vancouver region. Our temperatures are consistently around about 9 degrees Celsius, so that's quite cool. So that can slow down decomposition because it slows down the bacterial action.
The running shoes play an intriguing role in the discovery of the feet. The rubber soles of the runners act as floats to keep the feet adrift and protects them from scavenging birds and the UV rays of the sun.
Once the joint is disarticulated, then the foot is now free to perhaps float to the surface. And in particular, if the foot is in a light running shoe. We've all seen the trend over the last decade of shoes getting lighter and lighter, in particular running shoes, that the feet would be protected and possibly float to the surface. If the density of the shoe is light enough, it'll stay at the surface forever.
Because the feet are in an advanced state of decomposition, it's likely they spent a long time in water. Given that state of decomposition and the probable contamination of the feet, it may not be possible to obtain complete DNA samples.
As the technology becomes more and more sensitive, it becomes easier and easier to contaminate that sample. So anybody who comes into contact with that bone, for example, may contaminate it with their own sample just by touching it, breathing on it, sneezing on it. So it's contamination control is a key concern, and one of the reasons why it takes long to get DNA from these samples. Well, there's different ways to clean samples. You can sand it, you can rinse it with water and ethanol, and we actually expose all of the samples before we pulverize them to really intense UV light. Bleach is actually a cheap and effective way to decontaminate your evidence, so you can get rid of the DNA that you don't want.
Being able to obtain DNA samples remains the foundation of the investigation.
Once the victim is identified, we'll be able to see their history. That is, whether the person was out fishing, were they out on a boat? They might have fallen into the water, or is it that the person might be involved in organized crime, in a gang, etc.?
It is the mandate of the coroner's office to determine if a death occurred due to natural causes, suicide, or homicide. In a case such as the mysterious feet, that represents a big challenge.
It's not just relying on what the pathologist can advise, but also what the scene's telling you, what the history has indicated. We know of many accidents. There are plane crashes, there are boating incidents. We know of many missing people that we prioritize. Because there is always a potential that that person may have been brought by various currents and other ways to that particular point where the feet were recovered.
The high suicide rate is an important consideration in solving this mystery. Vancouver is located along the Fraser River and has a number of very high bridges that link the north and south shores. Over the decades, many people have chosen to end their lives by jumping to their death from these bridges. Another question is whether or not the feet could be linked to the cases of missing men in Metro Vancouver. Many of these men disappeared in or close to water. One of these missing men is John Kaler. His truck was found near Stave Lake, which flows into the Fraser River. The truck was running with the door open, the radio and the windshield wipers were on, and his cell phone was on the seat.
In the course of our investigation, we reviewed all of the missing persons files in the province. Then they were prioritized. And then these files were given to investigators to try to see if we could find additional clues.
But the mystery of the disembodied feet remains intact. Investigators compare the evidence they have gathered to the database of missing persons looking for leads. But this is not as easy as it sounds.
I can give you a sense of how difficult this problem is. When a foot washes up on shore, you have to understand that there are approximately 200 sets of unidentified remains that the BC Coroner Service has. We don't know who they are. And there's approximately 2,000 missing people reported in the province of BC alone. So it's a matter of matching up these 200 unidentifieds to 2,000 missing persons. There isn't DNA done on all of these samples yet. So when you throw a single bone or a single found foot into this mix, it's a huge problem to solve.
The DNA comparisons alone could add months, even years, to the investigators' quest for the facts. But will their efforts be rewarded with a match? Within 6 months, 3 disembodied men's right feet are found inside running shoes. They were found on 3 separate islands in the Strait of Georgia, British Columbia. Theories are multiplying. Were these victims of suicide, boating or marine accidents, or maybe the growing number of gang-related murders? Some people believe the feet may belong to victims of a plane crash near Quadra Island 2 years earlier. Since then, the wrecked plane has been recovered. There were no passengers on board. The seatbelts were not attached, suggesting that the victims escaped before the crash. The family's only hopes lie in the results from their DNA comparisons. Now that the bones from the feet have been cleaned, they can begin to extract samples used to create genetic profiles.
The process of getting DNA is actually, as good as the technology is today, is still a fairly labor-intensive process to get DNA from something like a bone sample. They have to carefully pulverize the sample right down to almost the consistency of flour to maximize the access to the remnants of DNA that were trapped all throughout that sample. The way we do it is to use what's called a cryogenic grinder. So we put it inside a sealed, sterile chamber with a metal impactor, and that goes inside a special instrument that's immersed in liquid nitrogen. And then that steel impactor goes back and forth and pulverizes that sample at very low temperatures. So we take that sample and we do a quantification on it to see if there's human DNA there. And if there is, then we go to the third step, and that's an amplification. Using a technique called polymerase chain reaction that allows you to amplify the regions of interest for identification. We call that an electropherogram, but it's just easier to say it's a DNA profile. It looks like, on a piece of paper, a series of colored peaks. And those colored peaks, as I mentioned before, can be transposed into a series of unique numbers.
Besides the human remains, the only other pieces of evidence are the runners. What can investigators discover from the shoes?
So we made inquiries with the manufacturers of the shoes to find out where the shoes were made, as well as where and when they were distributed, in an attempt to build a time frame of when the victims might have disappeared.
There's a lot that shoes can't tell you. There's a production date for a shoe, for instance. So that provides you with some sort of temporal parameters to look at. So you can start looking at missing people within a certain range of time. So there's a lot the shoes can provide. There's shoe sizes, there's male and female shoes. Not that that's a definitive way to make an exclusion in terms of sex, but there is a lot of information on the shoe that can certainly assist you with enhancing the profile of the individual who you believe to be deceased.
Investigators gave the ID numbers found inside the shoes to the manufacturers, who told them where the shoes were made and distributed. 2 of the runners were sold in North America, while the third one was sold in India. This information gives investigators a way to refine their search. The long process of creating genetic profiles for the 3 feet is complete. But that is only the first step in the identification process.
Once you get a DNA profile from that, all that tells you is the sex of the individual. Unless you have something to compare it to, it's really of no use. So the next half of the investigation is to find something to compare to.
They begin the difficult task of reviewing hundreds of files of missing persons using the criteria they have gathered, such as sex, dates of production for the runners, location, and date of when they were last seen alive. From those results, a list of people to whom the feet could belong to is produced. Relatives of the people on that list can then be contacted for samples of DNA to compare to the profiles made from the remains.
So that comparison could be running it against a database of known samples. It could be the investigator going out and speaking to the family and getting samples from the family to compare against. Or it could be going to the missing person's apartment and getting their toothbrush or razor to use as a source of known DNA for comparison. We have databases now that help us screen large numbers of profiles, but ultimately it's going to come down to an expert like myself that has to look at these 2 profiles from the bone and from some other source and do a statistical calculation and come up with an expert opinion on whether or not this is the deceased person you think it is.
While Dean Hildebrand compares results to the DNA database, the case of the unknown feet gets bigger. May 22, 2008, a man is walking his dog on Kirkland Island near the Vancouver airport. Kirkland is a small, uninhabited island in the Fraser River Delta. It is about 40 kilometers from Valdez Island, where the third foot was discovered 3 months earlier. A running shoe with a sock inside attracts the attention of his dog. The man looks inside the sock and discovers a human foot. This represents the fourth right foot in 9 months. However, it's the first female foot. Is the fact that they are all right feet a coincidence? Speculations run high. The most outrageous and diverse theories erupt. Is it the work of a serial killer whose calling card is right feet? Do these feet belong to victims of drownings in the Pacific Ocean? Could they belong to the victims of the Quadra plane crash? Maybe they belong to some of the thousands of missing persons in British Columbia. Will the genetic comparisons provide an answer to these questions? An ever-growing number of disembodied feet have been found in the Strait of Georgia, British Columbia. The discoveries stun the public and baffle authorities. The families of the victims of a plane crash, as well as those of dozens of missing men, anxiously await the results of the genetic comparisons with the feet. If the female victim has lived in British Columbia for a while, the chances of identification are better than for male victims because of the work done by the BC Cancer Agency.
The closest thing to a repository we have for potential known samples of DNA would be the BC Cancer Agency, who keeps Pap smears on file for obviously half of our population that has Pap smears done. And we've actually used Pap smears to identify skeletonized remains in the past. And a lot of investigators, well, it's getting better now, they know that. But those slides can be kept for many, many years, and they're known sources, they're medical samples from half our population.
But none of the Pap tests in the bank lead to an identification of a female foot. June 16, 2008, a couple is out for a walk on Westham Island in Delta, British Columbia. Floating on the water along the shore, they discover the fifth foot in less than a year. The island lies less than 1 kilometer from Kirkland Island, where the fourth discovery took place, so one might expect the feet to match. This foot belongs to a man, just like the other 3 feet, but it is the first left foot.
There was something very strange about either right feet or the source. In some sense, it was a bit of a relief when a left foot showed up as well. From a scientific perspective at the moment, I don't think we would speculate that right feet have any special characteristic over left feet. It's just the way things worked out.
The investigation reveals that one of the shoes was sold in India. This raises the questions: where did these feet come from, and how did they get into the Strait of Georgia? The investigators turned to the oceanographic community to help unravel the mystery. Dr. Richard Dewey has his own theory.
We do not believe they've come from the open ocean and ended up washing up on our shores. The oceanographic dynamics do not support that hypothesis. So in that sense, we can constrain the investigation to really being a local investigation. Georgia Strait is quite separated, and the flow at the surface, where these feet would have done most of their traveling, is outwards, out to the Pacific Ocean. So it's unlikely we're looking at a remote source. They're probably local.
But knowing that the feet are from this region does not do much to help the investigation. The Fraser River is 1,375 kilometers long, and the Strait of Georgia has an area of 6,800 square kilometers. That's more than 100 times the area of the island of Manhattan, an enormous area to investigate.
So there's a lot of circulation patterns that are going on at the same time, and Strait of Georgia is a very large basin, and it's influenced by primarily tidal motion.
The outflow of the Fraser River into the Strait of Georgia is enormous and has a significant effect on the surface current.
And all that fresh water flows into the Strait of Georgia and influences the circulation. So the Fraser River plume accentuates the circulation that would go around the inlet or around the basin and cause things to perhaps circulate for weeks or months and spread things out.
With the investigation covering such an extensive territory, determining the exact location of these feet is almost impossible. The number of possible scenarios is so high that it's difficult to narrow down the research.
It may seem surprising that these feet are found at very different beaches, but in reality, if you threw in a bunch of wood chips, the same thing would happen. You'd get wood chips eventually showing up on all the shores.
The results are finally in. Unfortunately, the DNA from the feet does not match any of the samples given by the families of the plane crash victims or the families of the missing men in British Columbia. The investigation has made some progress, but it's not exactly what everyone expected. They have found that the 3rd foot and the 5th foot belong to the same man.
The curious thing about these feet is the fact that they were washing up not all together, but spread out around the entire Strait of Georgia geographically and spread out over a long period of time. It turns out that 2 of the feet from the same body washed up on different shores months apart. The feet may come up weeks apart or they may come up very close together. If they come up weeks apart, they will enter different sort of circulations. As they come up, they may encounter different wind conditions, for example, come up at different times of the season. But even if they came up together, relatively close to the same time, the circulation patterns are complex enough that things would get separated over timescales of days to weeks. And the wind eventually blows things up onto the shore, the wave action and wind action, so eventually flotsam that floats on the surface will eventually end up on the shore. And so it's perhaps not too surprising that even feet from different bodies, but certainly the same body, ended up on opposite shores, separated by several months.
Another question that puzzles investigators is, what happened to the bodies of the 4 victims? Gail Anderson studies decomposition using the world's most advanced ocean research technology, the Venus Ocean Observatory.
When you're doing my kind of research in the ocean, accessibility is the main problem. Obviously, you need to have cameras down there, you need divers, you need boats. And this becomes very limiting financially, but also safety-wise. I can't put carcasses at very great depths if I'm using human beings to go down. And obviously, there's a limited amount of time that people can spend down there and how often they can go down. Venus eliminates all of those problems by having a remote camera on the bottom of the ocean that I can control from a laptop anywhere in the world.
Richard Dewey is the Associate Director of Research for the Venus Project at the University of Victoria.
Basically, the infrastructure that makes up the observatory is a shore station which provides power and communications to the subsea components, what we call a node. And the node is an underwater hub, if you like. It's where we plug instruments in, they get power, and they get Ethernet connection back to the shore station. So the marine cable and the node provide us with the permanent infrastructure sitting on the bottom, and then we lower down instrument packages, plug them into the node, and they're live on the internet and back here to the university where we log the data. Our primary set of researchers are ocean scientists and oceanographers, marine geologists, people that would typically be associated with marine research. But once we installed the observatory and the word got out there that we had this facility feeding data streams over the web, we were contacted by a variety of scientists that are outside the marine science environment. We have Gail Anderson with forensics. We have a variety of computing science and engineering scientists that have contacted us. They're interested in advanced systems or they're interested in complex data.
Gail Anderson experiments using pig carcasses. They're an ideal replica for humans because they are omnivores, relatively hairless, and roughly the same size as the adult human torso.
In my first carcass with Venus at 100 meters, a shark took out a large chunk of flesh on the second day, and that open area became a major site of almost all the activity. All the crabs, the shrimp, everything came to that area. In the second carcass, we didn't get a shark attack until about 2 weeks into the decomposition. And there, all the activity was centered around the gut region. where decomposition was taking place with bacterial action, and the large crabs were able to rip open that gut area, then the smaller animals were able to get in.
A third pig carcass has been placed at a much lower depth.
In the third carcass, it was a lot lower oxygen levels, so a lot of the larger animals like crabs couldn't get to the bodies. There was almost no damage to the pig for several months until the oxygen increased. The carcasses were pretty much scavenged of any tissue by about 21, 23 days after I placed them at 100 meters. A lot longer time, actually, at the shallower depths. But to actually see the bones completely separated and no cartilage left, it's about 40 to 43 days under these circumstances.
Regardless of the depth the victim sank to, it's probable that there was an onslaught of living organisms attacking the body. It's likely that the running shoes protected the feet and floated them to the surface. On June 18, 2008, another foot in a running shoe is found on Tyee Spit, located near Quadra Island. The shoe was given to the coroner's office, who quickly determines that the discovery is a fake. An examination by a pathologist establishes that jokers have stuffed the shoe with an animal paw, much to the despair of the families of the plane crash victims. The coroner now has 5 feet belonging to 4 unidentified victims. Do these people have something in common? Are they victims of the same accident, or the prey of a sinister murderer? In a period of 10 months, 5 human feet have been discovered encased in running shoes. They've been found on the shores of the Fraser River and islands of the Strait of Georgia in British Columbia. For the 6th time, the families of the missing persons and plane crash victims have had their hopes shattered. What appeared to be a 6th foot turned out to be a cruel hoax.
You know, when you stage a hoax like that and you take all the investigative resources and time to attend a scene, to process a case, that time could have been committed to making an identification on another case, bringing closure to this family. It's really devastating to the family because as soon as they hear of another human remains case found, they're all waiting for that call, they're expecting the worst. It puts families under a tremendous amount of pressure.
Authorities are still baffled. Investigators have not been able to put an identity to any of the human remains, and they have not found any evidence to link these remains to a crime. On July 10, 2008, about a year after the discovery of the first foot, the authorities hold another press conference. They present the new information they have: pictures of the running shoes, information on when and where the shoes were made, and where they were distributed.
So it's really important for us to utilize the media as an investigative tool to get very important pieces of information, some of those enhanced, detailed characteristics out into the community so that hopefully someone recognizes them and can associate that with somebody who's missing from their community, from their family.
The investigators also want to take the opportunity to educate the public. They ask Dean Hildebrand to attend the conference. He talks about the limitations of the standardized test used for forensic DNA analysis called STR, or short tandem repeats.
There's a lot of information in our DNA, obviously. I mean, our DNA will dictate what race we are. It will dictate our skin tones, our eye colors, hair colors. So that information is there. However, the DNA that we target for forensics, these STRs, all they do is tell you the sex. They're not good indicators of race. They don't tell you eye color, hair color, stature, anything like that. There is work being done in this field to try and tease out that information about perhaps the racial origins of a sample, a DNA sample, a set of remains. There's also common questions from police when they have a blood stain at a crime scene, for example. What can you tell me about the offender? We don't know anything about the person who left this. Obviously, we can tell them male or female, but can you tell me what skin color, what eye color, what hair color? That information is theoretically there, but it's not routine yet, getting access to that information.
The press conference generates dozens of leads. One family recognizes the first shoe and wonders if it belongs to one of their missing family members. Full of hope, they call the authorities and offer information. The investigators achieve their first real breakthrough.
They gave us a DNA sample, and the resulting profile has allowed us to identify the first foot as belonging to a person who was missing from the metro area of Vancouver. The information they told us was that the person was emotionally unstable.
We have made one identification, which has been very important, obviously, to the family, and also important because we can get a sense of the circumstances and the issues surrounding that death.
On October 21st, 2008, another discovery is made by a kayaker, but this time it's not a shoe. It's the body of John Kaler, floating in Stave Lake nearly 1 year after he went missing. His feet are intact. Then, on November 11th, 2008, while out for a walk near Finn Slough along the Fraser River, a couple finds a blue and white running shoe. It contains a size 7 left foot belonging to a woman. The coroner's office matches the 6th foot to the 4th foot found 6 months earlier on Kirkland Island, located directly across the Fraser River. This discovery brings the case to 6 feet belonging to 4 people.
We get about 7,500 to 7,700 cases reported to the Coroner Service every year. Of that, we probably end up at the end of the year with maybe 5 to 10 at the most, where we're still struggling to make an identification. If we look at all of our cases that date back as far as the 60s, we only have 200 unidentified human remains cases. So long as those human remains remain unidentified, we have to continue investigating. And, you know, I think the families should feel confident that we're doing everything that we can. We've used the type of all the latest types of technology that we can to enhance the profiles, and hopefully all of this effort will will be rewarded with an identification.
On October 27th, 2009, 2 men walking along the Fraser River, a few kilometers upstream from the last 3 discoveries, find the 7th foot to wash ashore in British Columbia in 2 years. The investigation of the disembodied feet continues.
These cases are not closed, as long as the victims have not been identified. So they could stay open forever. But one thing is certain is that before these incidents, I think that often people found or saw shoes along the beaches, and most people kept walking. Now, I think that, and this includes myself, I think if now we walk along a beach, along a shoreline, and you see a shoe, you'll probably stop and then look inside.
The waters of the Fraser River and the Strait of Georgia still hold their secrets. Maybe one day, another clue will wash ashore and reveal the identities of the disembodied feet of British Columbia.